This is Alamo Square in picturesque San Francisco, one of the most photographed and filmed locations. When I first visited this enchanting city at 11 years old, I remember being struck by its amazing architecture. I became infatuated by its sense of history and always dreamed of a day when I could live here. My name is Billy Clift, and this is my documentary, The Pure Eccentrics, San Francisco. This documentary is about a group of 5 eccentric gay men who have dedicated their lives to preserving the past. Webster's definition of eccentric is deviating from an established or usual pattern or style, especially in an odd or whimsical way. Each gentleman has expressed their form of being eccentric in their own very different way. Their homes, interiors, a way of life, their admirations, respect, and a love for a time of elegance and refinement. In 1906, fires ravaged most of the city's elaborate homes. Fortunately for us, this fine example still exists, an exuberant Queen Anne-style Victorian built in 1886 by architect Peter Schmidt for William Haas. The Haas Lilienthal House, the only intact private home of the period that is open regularly as a museum in San Francisco. Our first gentleman is truly a gentleman, a spokesperson for the Haas Lilienthal House, and has taken on the complete persona of a Victorian gentleman. He came to San Francisco right after World War II, a young man of 19, the pure eccentric, Mr. John Gall.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to San Francisco's premier Victorian mansion, Haas Lilienthal House. I'm John Gall. I'll be your guide. Follow me, please. I'm from Washington State, Western Washington, outside of Tacoma, a little place called Rocky Ridge on the slopes of beautiful Mount Rainier, the mountain that the Indians in that territory called Tahoma, the abode of the gods. That's where I'm from. The arrival, first I went to Seattle, met people there, and then realized that Washington State wasn't a safe place for a gay person who could not come out and admit it or would be damaged. And so the end of the Second World War came and people were going everywhere, and I said, I'm going too. And I got on a Greyhound bus and came to San Francisco and never wanted to leave it again. The gay life that I walked into, I can't speak for others, was to find an older mentor, a dignified gentleman who was a music director for Old St. Mary's Church, an organist, very well known. And he took me under his wing and told me that he would teach me the art and craft of being a San Franciscan. It started, I suppose, about 15 years ago. I was reading in the pink section of the newspaper about the Exploratorium wanting people to come and give tours of the Palace of Fine Arts and take training. I thought, well, I met Mr. Maybach, who designed it. So I went down there and took my training. And then, after a while, I began to understand that there was a pattern in the tour itself, an organic pattern. And then one day I thought, why don't I look like the time? So I put on a bowler hat, and I wore a stick pin, as you see, and a watch with chain and fob, and began giving tours there that looked old time, and then letters began arriving from around the world. What I'm interested in, I suppose, is not poetry as rhyme, but poetry as a way of thinking. That there were poetic elements in this house and in the way of the house of the old days An example, a gentleman entering the house would take out his card case and make everybody aware that he had a silver card case. He would place his card in a silver tray on the hall table for somebody to come and pick up. And then when he closed the case, it was done in a gentle, courteous manner. Pat the case and place it back in the pocket. That poetic approach to life and another time. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the front parlor of the Grand Hasmonean House, San Francisco's mansion. In the old days, this room was dark. Heavily blinded windows, heavy plush curtains in cranberry red. Then, on the evenings and special occasions where there were formal dinners and guests arrived like horse-drawn carriage with tinkling bells. And they came into the front parlor, into a dark room. But the front parlor maid began to bring candlesticks and candelabra with beeswax candles with a lovely scent and color to light the room. Why? I thought you'd never ask. It was said that in those old days of old San Francisco, in a candlelit room, the gentlemen looked younger and more handsome, and the ladies, it was said, looked far more desirable. In the house here, I tell people if they're in the front of the house in the public rooms and that old clock chimes, clock older than the house, sound of the chiming clock is the sound of the chiming past. Listen, learn. It will teach you something. You know, you ask about persona. In the world I occupy, at a certain point, the persona becomes the person and the person becomes the persona. They become one. Then, in presenting a house tour, it's authentic. It's not acting anymore. The persona becomes the person.
This is Alamo Square's newest edition. Our next gentleman orchestrated and landscaped this beautiful Victorian planner donated by San Francisco's A. Silvestri. Our youngest gentleman, an accomplished painter of oils and watercolors, a craftsman, a collector of fine classical furniture and paintings and antiquities. His passion for preservation is truly an inspiration to me. He and his partner live in an East Lake-style Victorian house with a classical arrangement of rooms. Mr. Wayne David Hand.
Welcome to our home. Please come in. I was born in Blackfoot, Idaho. Grew up in Oregon for the most part, and moved to California right after high school. And I guess the thing that, when I think back on what makes someone unique, for myself, I think it was that I always saw the world as this really fascinating place. Every object, everything, everything about it. And objects then became a way for me to understand the world, especially history. In everything that I've brought into my life, into my surroundings, there's a story, a connection to the world, to history, to other human beings, to techniques, the way things are made. It's all connected. And to me, that's what this stuff is all about. You know? It really is a rich city, a wonderful, vibrant, exotic city filled with incredible, eccentric people. I don't think it would be too far to say that it is an eccentrocracy. I've heard that term used, and it is very much so for me. We're now in the front parlor of the house. It's actually a double parlor, double room. but in the front section, and I have something I'd like to show you. I have a number of collections in the house, and in this cabinet, it's actually a secrétaire à bâton, a writing desk, French writing desk. In this very special little case are three scent bottles that are thought to have belonged to Louis Philippe, the last king of France. And this came down to me through a duke in the French court, and it's beautifully marquetried, but one of them is very special. This one right here. At one time, this scent bottle was broken. The rim was repaired with solid gold. If you look close here, you'll see the repair, which I think makes it all the more special. This part of the parlor is called the back parlor, or the sitting room, technically, but because it's all one room, we've treated it as such. This is a copy, an 18th century copy of Christopher Allore's work called Judith and Holofernes. But also in this room, you'll notice there are a lot of black items, and they are black porcelain, namely Wedgwood black basalt. And there's one very special piece I'd like to point out. It's on this Biedermeier chest. And this piece of black basalt is perhaps one of the largest pieces the Wedgwood Company manufactured. It has a reticulated top, pierced, and is thought to have been commissioned by the Church of England, perhaps even the Archbishop of Canterbury, as a potpourri or a scent burner and for a censer. And neoclassical in tradition, probably made about 1805, 1810, and is this incredible bowl supported by three dolphins, classical dolphins. Technically, it's a very difficult thing to have been able to make on fire. And Wedgwood essentially invented black porcelain. He was trying to emulate early pottery, Etruscan pottery, and created a black porcelain body that was so sturdy and so beautiful. It was really his favorite thing. In fact, during his day in the 18th century, there were so many people buying black basalt. There were 240 some manufacturers in England alone. And this is a day and age when white skin was revered, and so women pouring a cup of tea from a black teapot made their skin look all the whiter. So it was very popular in its day. This section right here has 14 layers of glazing and paints, and then a 23 karat gold leaf, which picks out the design. And the pattern is Moorish in design, or Turkish or Arabic. It's certainly Mid-Eastern influenced with the 8-pointed star. And all of this hallway eventually will be hand painted. And I can show you this area right here. This section is completely finished. This is all hand painted with Venetian plaster. It's burnished with agates and then waxed. And then, of course, this is all hand-painted with oil paints on the gold leaf. I guess I've tried to define the different facets of who and what I'm about by my collections. You know, all of the neoclassical furnishings that are in this room, to me, that's about the Age of Enlightenment. That's about knowledge and understanding and the classical world.
Born and raised here in San Francisco, a prominent architect, a preservationist, and a historian. For more than 60 years, he has made his commitment to study the architecture and history of the city. He now lives in a Palladian villa of his own design in beautiful Sonoma. Architect, Mr. James Beach Alexander.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Villa Demeter. That's the name of my modest little villa, which is patterned after the villas done by Andrea Palladio, who was a 16th century Italian architect who lived in the Veneto, about 30 miles from Venice, up the Brenta Canal. And his beautiful houses, all in the classical style, copied from the ruins of ancient Rome and Greece. were built by the aristocracy of Venice. My house has a classical name in the tradition of Palladian villas. It's called the Villa Demeter. And Demeter was one of the primary goddesses in the hierarchy of classical mythology. Just like in Charles Dickens' book, I could say I was born sentence. That I was born in San Francisco in 1924 at the St. Francis Hospital. I'm surprised there's no plaque up yet to show that I was born there, but I'm sure there will be. Well, I was my mother's child in the family. My father was too busy playing golf or belonging to clubs and all that. We never saw it. I don't know whether it was to get away from both of us, I'm not sure. But my mother, of course, created my interest in architecture and in decorating. When I was a little kid, she would take me by my hot and sticky hand and we'd climb over the hills of San Francisco and look at old houses. And when we come up to Sonoma, where I'm now living, my father would play in golf tournaments, and that left Mother and me to fend for ourselves. And so we'd walk from the Sonoma Mission Inn into town and look at old adobe houses. And I later wrote a book about the adobe houses in Sonoma. So you see how all that sort of carries over. When I was 12 years old, I went to see the movie San Francisco with Clark Gable and Jeanette MacDonald, and it changed my life. I thought, boy, what a place. And the movie said San Francisco was sensuous and vulgar. I think the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce was leaning on the producers when they made San Francisco. So I would, the earthquake had just been 30 years before. This was 1936, and so all those old timers were around still, and they could tell you about it. And I hounded them all to tell me the stories about old San Francisco. And I said, what was it really like? They said it was vulgar and it was sensuous, and what a hell of a good place to grow up. After my parents had died, I had that big house and I didn't want to stay in it. So I took the money from the sale of the house and started buying Victorian houses. And the banks wouldn't even finance them. They said, who in the hell would be interested in living in old dumps like these old Victorian houses around San Francisco? And that was when the Western Addition thing began, when they began to tear down all of that, blocks and blocks. And then it stayed that way for years. It looked like Blitz London, just nothing but empty foundations and steps leading to nothing. It was tragic. I don't think it's any surprise to us to realize that gay people are the great ones at buying old houses and restoring them. Straight people are too busy diapering babies and trying to get along in life and paying for the Bendix washing machines and all the rest to fool around with preserving historic houses. It's a challenge, and it's expensive, and it takes time and effort to restore an old house properly. But I think it's the gay element that has been responsible for so much of this in America. And in the 60s, when they were tearing down buildings that were perfect Parthenons, it was the gay people who would crusade to save them, This is the main room of my little house, and I call it the loggia because Italian villas always had a garden room or a room that had open doors and windows to the outside, and gave you the feeling of more spaciousness, and perhaps more greenery would be in this room to make it a perfect loggia. It was a sitting room, or more of a porch than anything else. But this is to give the effect of a porch with the doors opposite doors, and then of course the enfilade, which is the description of rooms in a row with doors and opposite windows, so it gives a sense of spaciousness. So you feel that you're looking through a corridor more than just into a room or a box. This house was built of odds and ends of old houses that were being torn down in San Francisco, and the Sigmund Stern house, which was a neighboring house to mine, was full of wonderful architectural details. And these young men bought the house just for a or leased it just to be able to remove all of the good architectural things before the house was demolished. And so I was quite involved with them. I felt like William Randolph Hearst saying, I'd like this room, and I'd like that cornice, and I'd like those pilasters. That's what these columns that are engaged to the wall are called, and it gives it extra detail and importance to the room. The painting on the west wall is the only piece of modern art that I have here in the house, and it was done by a dear friend of mine whose husband was a doctor. And she looked into his microscope and saw this marvelous cult that was being under glass, and so she decided it would make a wonderful subject for a painting. And then to her chagrin, after she'd done the wonderful painting, she found out that was a syphilis cult. So this is my particular treasure wall. Those pieces are my finest antiques. They were made in the 18th century for Gustav III, the King of Sweden. And he had a pavilion, just like Marie Antoinette's Petit Trianon. He had one called the Haga Pavilion. They said he put his wife and his kitchens across the road. And the crest on the top is a beehive, and with sheaves of wheat around it. And of course, in the end, I wound up writing this book about old houses of San Francisco, whether they're standing or not. And it made a great big fat book. And it probably is the accomplishment of my life. So, I mean, it was always in my blood to be interested in architecture and houses, because they tell about the people who lived in them. They aren't just inanimate objects. They live and they breathe. They have souls just as people do. And some people object to that. They don't like to think of a house that outlasts them. That's a matter of ego.
When I first moved to my Victorian home a few years ago, right next door to this gentleman, I had no idea that it would open a door to a whole new world. He became my inspiration to create this documentary. Born in San Francisco, he's a reputable real estate agent and a dedicated preservationist to his Italianate-style Victorian duplex. Mr. Richard Jordan.
Welcome to Rosewood Hall. Please come in. I was born here in San Francisco, and as a young child, probably about 4 years old, our family moved to Southern California, and I went through school down there, through high school, and then I went to college in San Luis Obispo, Cal Poly, and City College of San Francisco, and I decided to stay here. I was a little confused about whether or not I wanted to stay in Southern California or here, but I decided this was the place to be. So here I am. Then, in the 70s, I decided it was time to buy a home for myself. I've always been interested in old furniture, old artifacts, and anything old has always fascinated me ever since I was a small child. So having a house like this gave me an opportunity to carry out my interests in old things. This has been a great house for partying. I think the first party I had was before I had my furniture moved in here. The house was basically empty. I invited about 30 people, suggested they wear whatever was comfortable because there was no furniture. And I had a punch machine going in one of the rooms, and there was music, and there was plenty of room to dance because there was no furniture, and it was a really great party. Everybody had a great time seeing this house in its original form. Then as time went by, there was dinner parties. Dinner parties have always been a favorite here. And then started having Thanksgiving dinners. I used to cook a turkey in that wood stove, which is kind of unusual. I had fired with coal, made it awfully hot in the kitchen, but turkey came out just fine in the coal wood-burning stove in that oven. We really had some wonderful times in this house over the years. We still are. I moved into this house in 1972, and I spent many, many years doing projects like plumbing and wiring, new kitchen, and new roof. And finally, got around to doing this Victorian restoration in these parlors. Once I had this fireplace installed, I was ready to do the work on the walls and woodwork. At first I was going to wood grain the woodwork because it was sort of appropriate in a Victorian house, but Victorian Interiors suggested that I do something different with the woodwork because the wallpaper was a Japanese design from the 1880s, and they encouraged me to paint the woodwork black and red and gold, which was sort of frightening to begin with, but I'm happy I did it. It works together perfectly. Then the ceiling paper was nicely designed, and they included bird blocks because I happen to have a lot of birds sitting around here and there. Then the drapery treatment began. Roger Reed did the design on that. It was an inspiration from Dick Reutlinger's bedroom because I like the side draperies and the tassels. Can't have enough tassels. As you heard, I do have a collection of clocks. This one I bought many years ago, and I had no idea where I was going to put it. I just liked the clock. But once I finished redoing this room, I discovered that it worked perfectly on this mantle. There are clocks in almost every room. There's a dozen or so. I also have a animal and bird collection that you'll be seeing. Most of them have names, not all of them. I have a deer up here whose name is Frederick, and then I have this gazelle and an owl, Hedwig. They were appropriate during the Victorian period, so that's why they're all here. Now we're in the second parlor, more commonly known as the Maxfield Parish Memorial Gallery and Music Room. The reason being there's a collection of Maxfield Parish lithographs in here. And then there's the piano that belonged to my great aunt in Santa Monica. She purchased it in 1926. It's an Iverson Pond and still sounds great. Now here we are in the kitchen with my collection of vintage stoves. This one is my newest one. I bought that just a few years ago because I decided it was time to upgrade and get something really modern. And then that is the old stove that was replaced. I kept that stove because it's just such a great appliance. It's a combination wood burning, coal burning, and gas. I also enjoy shopping for things that fit appropriately in the house with my friend Dean Poulton, who is also a collector. His collection in his house is a little different than mine. He lives in a condominium in Oakland, which is positively magnificent. But we go to the Hillsborough Antique Show 3 times a year, and almost always come home with little treasures to put in our houses. It's just something that we look forward to each time we go, and we never know what we're going to come home with. It's just amazing how we find things that are appropriate we have to have. Sometimes I wasn't quite sure about buying a certain item and I have to go back the next day. One time I went back in a driving rainstorm. It was just awful, just to get, well, it was Jacob, I think. Decided that I had to have Jacob. So it was an extra trip down there just to get him. That's my Swiss mountain goat. That's just another passion, is shopping, finding things. It's great fun. I love it.
Just off Alamo Square on Grove Street, where there are numerous homes that have been painstakingly preserved, lives one of the founders of the San Francisco Victorian Alliance. His home has been photographed and filmed for numerous books, articles, and television programs. This is definitely the premium example of an opulent, Italianate style Victorian home with a vast collection of furniture, player pianos, and antiquities. The Pure Eccentric, Richard Reutlinger.
Welcome to the Brune Reutlinger house. and stepping back into the era of 1886 when the house was built. I was born in Lexington, Nebraska, the actual geographic center of the U.S., one of the most boring areas you could possibly be born in. Spent the first 19 years living there and wondering when I could get out. But I got on the train and came to San Francisco, really kind of thinking I'd go on to Alaska because that was going to be the last frontier. Well, you know, you get to San Francisco and you kind of like the place. In my case, I instantly fell in love with the city, already knew a lot about its history, and never went on. I had looked for about a year because I knew I wanted a big house and I truly couldn't afford very much. I doubled my money in the house on Elizabeth Street in order to get into this building. And as I said, worked on it for about 9 months before it was a habitable house. It was in that bad a shape. So eventually I did get moved in and I rented out rooms for a number of years to make second mortgage payments. And it was a great time in San Francisco. And this particular block was a lot of fun to live on. We were in the midst of a black ghetto, although we didn't have any street crime in those days. The drug scene had not gotten really going, and so this particular 800 block of Grove Street had survived really well. The houses nearly all were intact, and the gay community had already moved in and started to work on these places. And once the neighbors found out that I had bought this house and that I was going to restore it, they were so supportive in helping with ideas and craftspeople and things like that. They'd bring me champagne and sandwiches when I was working here, and so that's when I really began to put the house back into the 1880s, kind of taking it a room at a time, finding craftspeople to work on the place, which was difficult in the late 60s and early 70s. There was not that much restoration going on in San Francisco, and this house needed a lot. One example, in the dining room, about a third of the ceiling was totally missing when I bought this place. It was just bare lath up there, and I did find this little old man who came in and built a 2x4 scaffold and ran the cornice work in place and replaced the ceiling, and then disappeared. It probably passed away. We never could find him again when other friends needed his work. I found two guys who did the faux graining, and we had to regrain a lot of the woodwork because so much of it had been painted over the years here in the house. But as the years went by, particularly when the mid-70s and the bicentennial was coming around, people got more involved in restoration and preservation, and by that time we had also founded the Victorian Alliance, which is kind of a neighborhood but citywide organization that focuses on preservation and restoration. And I had gotten very active with the group, became their treasurer in 1977, and I still am. I've been sort of the continuity of the organization, as many regimes have changed over the years. We're coming into the double parlors here, which is kind of Egyptian revival gone wild. It all started because I bought a cornice that I put over the second parlor windows. And when we redid this room 15 years ago, Artistic License, a group, a guild of artisans here in San Francisco, created the gold cornice here in the bay window. Both cornices and a pier mirror here in the parlors have busts of Cleopatra there. So, of course, once I got those up, then we decided to go whole hog for other Egyptian items like the statuary in the corners. One set here that is not Egyptian revival, but has a lot of local provenance, is this set of Victorian parlor furniture, which has an interesting local provenance. Our premier madam in town, Sally Stanford, owned it originally, and I bought it out of her estate a number of years ago. A couple of other things that are kind of interesting are the two grand pianos here. They're one of the very few pieces in the house that are not 19th century. They're both 1928. They're both called what are reproducing pianos because the rolls reproduce all the expression of the artist as well as the notes, and they were far better than phonograph recordings of pianos in the 20s, and so they were very popular. I have people like Rachmaninoff playing his own compositions, etc., on these particular instruments. The chandeliers in here are not original to this house, but they are from the period and have kind of an Egyptian feel to them also. The color scheme throughout the room was put together by artistic license. 18 members of the group worked on the room over a 9-week period, and ultimately they won a national award on the work that they did. The color scheme in this whole room was done actually using some pictures of Australian interiors that Bruce Bradbury had showed me. So the room actually is a bit more ornate than it was originally. The original color scheme in here was 3 shades of olive green, which is much darker than I really cared for. And since it's not a museum house, I could do what I wanted to do. An unusual piece here in the furniture is this little tete-a-tete here in the center of the room, the courting chair where the two could sit side by side and converse but not touch each other. One of the other pieces here in that parlor that's a good piece of furniture is this sofa here, made by Jelliff and Company. It's interesting because it has the men's heads as handles to the sofa, which is kind of unusual. This dining room really was kind of the room that sold me on buying this house 40 years ago. This house is architect designed by Heinrich Geilfus, a German immigrant architect, and I did not know that at the time I bought the house. I just realized it had wonderful proportions. This house is on a 30-foot wide lot, so the scale of the whole house is somewhat larger than a standard San Francisco row house. One of Geilfus's kind of hallmarks is the big built-in sideboard at the far end of the dining room, which is all solid walnut with burl walnut panels. The rest of the woodwork throughout the room is actually redwood or fir that's been painted to look more expensive, like the walnut sideboard. The other original furnishing in the house that dates back to the time of the Broom family, the original builders of the house, is the gold mirror here over the mantelpiece. Somehow that survived and did not get vandalized and did not get painted over. Another interesting piece here in the dining room is the gold epergne here on the dining room table, which actually is Elkington silver plate dated 1858. A former owner got tired of polishing it and had it gold plated, and I have to say I'm grateful. A couple of other important pieces here in the dining room are the 2 ebonized cabinets on either side of the archway. They were made by Herder Brothers in New York, one of the absolute top manufacturers of Victorian furniture in the 1870s and 80s. This master bedroom is unique in a couple of respects in the house. The photography in this room is all my own family, about 4 different generations. But the real unique feature is the ceiling treatment. It's all hand stenciled work. The wallpapers were not available in the early 1970s when we did this room. In those days, if you didn't like cabbage roses or red flock, you were just out of luck. So Larry Boyce was the designer who adapted an 1886 design from a pattern book to this room. He and 2 accomplices worked on it 7 weeks one summer. At the completion, they estimated that they had applied around 2,300 stencils in the process. The bedroom set in this room, of course, is the grandest in scale of the bedroom furniture. I always like to use it as an example of how absolutely awful Victoriana was considered in the 1950s and 60s when I was first collecting. I purchased this set in 1960 at Butterfield's Auction Gallery, but in those days it was down in the basement auction. You would not want it upstairs with the good stuff. It might contaminate something. Had to pay a whole $135 for the entire set. It doesn't happen anymore, I can tell you. Not everybody wants to do as complete a period job as I really prefer. One of my neighbors across the street has a lovely Victorian house, but it's what I consider underfurnished. But he thinks I have much too much stuff, and my philosophy of decoration is that there cannot be a plain wall anywhere, a plain surface. It's got to have pattern. And any surface that's horizontal has to be covered with things. You got to have. And he says, well, they never did that. And I said, well, you might look at some authentic interior photographs and just see how busy Victorian houses were. So anyway, the result now is a very cluttered, very 1880s interior at 824 Grove Street. Well, having this house over the years, I got involved in doing commercial house tours, and a couple of funny instances of how people don't listen to what you tell them. When people come in for a commercial tour, I get them all together down in the dining room, and I give them the history of the house. Then I give them a traffic pattern and turn them loose to go through the house on their own. And this one woman came up to me after she had done the whole tour, looked at everything in the house. She came up to me and she said, "Well, have you ever thought of modernizing?" And I have to admit, I was speechless. One of the few times in my life that I was. I finally said, "Not in my lifetime, dear," and left. And yet another instance, years ago, I was doing an open house for the Musical Box Society, and I was standing down in the front hall. This woman came rushing down the front stairs and said, "Oh, I've got to get out of this house. It's so overdone, it's making me ill." I have a neighbor across the street who once in a while put his house on tour, but he never wants to be there when it does because he's afraid somebody's going to make a derogatory comment. I said, "Phil, that's the fun of doing this. If it bothers you, you shouldn't be doing the tours."
These men inspired me in many ways. They inspired me to look at objects, my home and world differently. And I thank them for being these pioneers, our pioneers in preserving the past and assisting us in the future.
As you know, hundreds of wonderful quotes that relate to the hearth and eating and the food, the substance of life.
Jug of wine, a loaf of
Yes.
bread.
Or you could just say what I always say, Wayne.
What's that?
The fastest way for a man's heart is through his stomach.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I have the privilege of working with the executive chef at the Italian Consulate, and one of his primary clients was President Clinton and Hillary when they would be in town. So I'd be his co-assistant at either the residences that he stays at or at the Italian Consulate. And this is one of Hillary's signature dishes at the White House, pecan encrusted chicken stuffed with Dungeness crab, spinach, roasted red pepper, and roasted garlic, and encrusted with the pecan and sauteed. But this is one of the signature dishes that she used.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to House Lilienthal House. I love everything that's old. Old books, old music, old wine, old friends. But old friends are best to your health.
That's good. Charming.
Roast tenderloin of beef. What I do with this, I make an authentic bordelaise. I got the marrow bones, roasted them, then simmered them with the vegetables for 8 to 10 hours. And we reduce it with Cabernet Sauvignon reduction with the shallots and mushrooms. One of my favorite times I've served this was as executive sous chef at the Running Hotel in Yosemite National Park. And the Queen visited there March 6th and 7th of 1983.
San Franciscans to Pure Eccentrics, one and all at this table. And I'm proud to be with you in company, and I'm proud that you're here to Pure Eccentrics.
Yes. Right. Drink to that.
Now, I was told recently by an Italian young lady, you have to, when you toast, you look in the eyes, because you'll have 7 years bad sex if you don't. When you're toasting. Cousin?
Have to look the person in the eye.